Button there next to her.
Good morning.
Morning.
It's definitely been an update. It looks different.
Things have changed. I see my phone's on silent. There we go. Righty, good morning.
Gracie, don't be that person. Happy Sunday, everyone. Good morning.
Morning,
Welcome.
guys. I have the grey filter on. You see, that's why.
It's funny how it only works on you.
Morning, beautiful Sunday morning. A little bit cool. Gracie, yes? So I had to put jersey on last minute. Right. Last weekend we were in Welkom. It wasn't as cold as we expected it to be. It was actually really nice, but we had a really good time there with Kingdom Ministries in Welkom. And that YouTube link is still on the page. You can search after it on the page for last week. It's there. That's why there was no broadcast last Sunday morning.
Good morning, Danelle.
But back. Morning, everyone. Leonard, Danelle, and there was someone before that.
I think it was Danelle.
It was Danelle. Good morning. Good morning.
Thanks for spending time with us today.
It is actually a spectacular day.
Spectacular.
Oh, toothless one.
Just so you know, he doesn't use this type of vocabulary normally.
He tells me every day I look spectacular.
There you go. Gracie, don't be like that. Angelika, nice to have you with us this morning. Great. Well, what do we do? What else? Have you got anything to say for yourself?
Yes.
I can't top your weather report, so I'm just giving you some space.
It's not a broadcast without a weather report.
Alta is there. Good morning, Alta.
Dali.
And good morning, Dali.
Isabel.
And Tindrin. Hope
Morning,
you guys.
guys.
Are all good.
Nice to have you with us. Looking forward to it. Good morning. Robbie. Welcome.
Can we go now?
I think so. I think you can
Yeah.
if you like.
Hey, just make sure you close both doors and keep the dogs.
These are the
okay.
doggies, eh?
Turn
Alright.
the container to the left.
Hope you guys are well, and I hope that you've had a good week. Hi, Shan from Cape Town.
Shani.
Hope you've had an awesome week, and you're taking a bit of a break today, hopefully. And yeah, thank you for being with us for a couple of moments.
That's getting warm now.
It is actually.
It's a tea.
It is. Oh, that's what it is. That's what it is. But anyway, we'll stick it out.
Okay. Shall we start?
I think we should go ahead, although we are a little bit quick today.
We can go ahead.
We go ahead. All right. Awesome. Well, we were busy before we went offline last weekend. We were busy with the book of Romans, and it's kind of turning into a bit of a journey in the book of Romans. And title for the last session was, Is there anything free at all? And we spoke about free justification. And the context is the book of Romans, which is Paul writing to the church in Rome, I guess. And now you have Gentiles and Jews together. And I think that's important to know, that that's what this book is about. It's about Paul introducing the Gentiles to the Jews, and at the same time also introducing the Jewish ideas to the Gentiles. They're now one, but they're so different. So I think that's where the real value of this book lies, is understanding the context of the book. It's this huge, long Jewish history, an exclusive type of history, and suddenly it has to be accepted, and it has to be somehow distributed into a church which is now no longer just Jewish. And I think if you realize that that's what's going on in the book of Romans, it brings a lot of understanding about what Paul is actually trying to introduce. So there were two concepts, and we only dealt with one of them the last time we were online here. And the first one was free justification. Now that is it's an alien, I think it's an alien concept to someone who would live under a regiment like the law. Because you'd had to kind of get into all of these things that had to be done.
Alien in that it's free.
Yeah, it's a weird concept because of all the purity restrictions and what has to be done and what can't be done, and also the severe penalties for not doing certain things and doing certain other things. So I think the idea of free justification is quite novel. Also, the idea of just justifying people is also quite novel. And I just want to spend a moment on the idea of justification. because, you know, it's been 2,000 years of us using this in Christian contexts, and it can become really, really messy, because in Christian theology, you have ideas like reconciliation and justification, salvation, and reconciliation, and all of these things. Sometimes we feel like they all mean the same thing, and actually they don't, but it gets too messy if we do. And, you know, people are just not, these days, people are not into a messy or a complicated ideas about God. They want it simple, you know, like do ABC and that's it. And I guess the church has to some degree simplified things, but that doesn't always bring us closer to the truth by just throwing them all into one little basket and saying, oh, put up your hands, say this rhyme, and then everything's fine. And I don't think things are quite as simple as that. But so I just wanted to spend a moment on the idea of justification. What could it mean that God would justify freely? So the first type of idea that comes to mind is someone that's done something wrong, and you just say, it's okay, whatever you've done, it's okay, it's fine. But I don't think that's what justification is. It's rather acceptance of the person without putting a stamp of approval on the actions the person might be engaging in, but becoming aware of or making known that you understand the mitigating circumstances within which the actions are done.
Yeah.
In other words, God justifying us. The word justify, from what I can see from at least the Greek word, it means to render someone innocent, or to you know, in a way, like you would justify your actions. Like I do that all the time. If I do something and Tori's unhappy with me, my first response is the justification of everything I've done. And I will go to lengths to justify myself. And I think that's more kind of what justification points towards. It's God basically saying, look, what you're doing is a mess. Like you are messing up, and you're causing a lot of hurt, and you are doing things wrong, if we could put it simply. But I understand why you are acting the way you are. And so the act does not separate you from me. I accept you with your act. I might not like the act, but I do accept you with the act because I understand. And I think that's more the idea of Christian idea of reconciliation, very particularly justification, meaning that God doesn't look at us and say, oh, you've done everything great, so I make you innocent. It's more I understand why you're in the mess you're in. I understand why you're making the choices you are, and I accept you as the person over and above your actions, and because
mistakes.
I understand why you're making these mistakes. I think that's a better idea of what justification might be. And I think then it also becomes clearer why this would be so free. So to justify someone freely, I think is what's quite novel. And I think if you've been a Jew all your life and you've tried to keep the law so well, and now you're sitting next to you sits the Roman, and you know, he's just not doing any of that stuff. Paul is actually trying to say that justification from God actually comes to us for free, and really for free, and not the human for free, like there's a hidden debt or a hidden motive. It really is free. And I think that would have been hard for the first century Jewish people to kind of accept because of where they come from. But the second one is the one we never really spoke about last time, and so I want to read, and this is found in Romans 3. Paul carries on. He says in verse 27. So where's the boasting then? Like, and then he concludes. He answers his own question by saying it's excluded because it's no longer by faith. In other words, nobody can come to God and say, or can come to anyone and say, look, God has accepted me because I have been like this, because I have done these things. God accepts me, and I think it's a huge breakthrough for people who are serious about their relationship with God, and to realize that there's really nothing we could do for the acceptance of God. If we end up doing things for God, or doing things we feel are the better way to do things, and doing that sacrificially in some sense, in other words, it's not easy to do them, but we do want to do them, we can't do this for acceptance, because then we nullify the simplicity and actually the love that comes with the acceptance.
Yeah.
But the other part is found here in verse 29, when Paul asks a very important question. He says, is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not also the God of the Gentiles? And then he says, yes, of course, also the God of the Gentiles. And so I think this would also have been a worrying thing for Jews, because in the ancient pagan world, there were hundreds, thousands literally of gods identified by humans, and every little town almost at some point had its patron god, which it served and sacrificed to in return for favors and blessing, etc., etc. And the Jews were not a big nation; they were a minority, enslaved, oppressed people. And they clung to their understanding of God, which we read about in the Old Testament, which we today call Yahweh or Jehovah. It was theirs, He was their warrior that protected them from all the things out there. They called to him and he saved them. And so it was precious to them that he is their God. But here Paul comes and he says, look, well, Jews already know there's actually only one God, but the turn on the books is this, that he's actually not just the God of the Jews, and that he's actually everyone's God. And there's no real such thing as our God is an awesome God, he reigns. There's actually no such thing as our God. And I think these two things, they are things that have crept up, I think, in my own life, and I think it is a question for many people, or it is something that we as Christians today need to be careful of, and that's kind of the backdrop on which we're throwing Romans 3, 4, and 5 today is, are we stepping into the same traps, the ancient traps that the Jews fell into? Are we again saying, no, justification is not free? It's actually not free. You have to do A, B, C, and D. Okay, now we're not talking about circumcision, but we are talking about other things. Strictly speaking, the way I understood what I grew up in, justification is free to those who become born again. So to become born again, what you need to do is you need to do this. It's a special moment in your life where you take a certain action. The way I grew up, you had to say a specific type of prayer, and that specific type of prayer kind of opens you up. And in some circles I guess still exist, you can actually lose that thing. Like if you do enough bad stuff, you end up on the outside of that again, and you have to come back to God. And like you end up in church every Sunday is a come back to Jesus service, because you're so afraid that you are losing this free gift, missing the point of what it means to give a free gift to someone. And I think the other thing we also kind of overemphasize and we can easily get entrapped with is to think that God is our God. There really does not exist anything like that.
They did in the Old Testament.
Well, in the Old Testament it had to.
Yeah.
But really the cross comes to kind of take that away. And this is the argument Paul is making to the Jews. And I think that we need to be careful we don't step into the same type of traps.
And ask a question.
Yeah.
So isn't it quite a common saying in Romans or in the New Testament when we are justified by faith?
Yes. That we were going to speak about that in a moment,
Okay.
So
because you're saying that we come from a place where we believe that for Christians it's free justification. So
yes.
If it's not that, what is justified by faith?
What does it actually mean?
Yeah.
No, and that's what we're going to have a look at today. So the next little portion we find here is in chapter 4, and Paul's kind of laying this out. It's not as simple as you'd want it to be, and it's not as easy as just saying, oh, that's exactly what it means, because it's quite complicated, especially if you take Romans 5 into account. And I think here, Tori, is where we need to draw some type of difference between what it means to be reconciled to God or justified by God and what it means to become saved. Right, and here we have to step outside the traditional boundaries of understanding saved and justified and reconciled as all the same thing, and basically the end result of that, I get to go to heaven. If you're not willing to step outside of that boundary, there's nothing for me to say. So I've stepped outside of that boundary quite a long time ago in my life. I started realizing that salvation is got nothing to do really with the ability to go to heaven, but salvation is a transformative thing that God does. It's deliverance, protection, etc. It's got to do with the transformation of the inner person, walking into the promises of God. Maybe you can add that to it. But that ideas like justification and reconciliation really are truly without requirement to some degree. But we're going to put that into your question in a moment. And that's what today is really about. So for Paul to address the issue of now he's dropped the bomb of free justification, and God is actually the God of everyone, not just of us. Paul draws on Abraham, right? Because Abraham is kind of like the father of the Jewish nation, of course, or of Israel, of course, and where the whole story starts. With this man that was willing to leave everything and follow this new God, that, at least to him, it's a bit of a rabbit trail here, but I don't think Abraham just in the moment God kind of pressed upon him, said, oh, here it is, this is the real God, there's no other gods. He grew up in a polytheistic type of environment, and I think his first inclination would have been simply, here's a God that's showing specific interest in me, let me see where this leads. But okay, I know a lot of people won't like that, but that's probably the context in which those things happen. But in chapter 4, and that's where we're kicking off today, in chapter 4, Paul's trying to explain how can this now be free, and how can God be not just our God but everyone's God. This is a huge transition, which I feel like we're still not really making. We're just not making that transition yet as Christians. But anyway, so he calls up Abraham, and I'll read verse 2. He says, for if Abraham was justified by works, he would have something to boast about. He would say have something to glory in, is what the King James says. But the glory would not be before God. In other words, he's saying, look, how did Abraham, what was Abraham's process like? Now, Abraham's process sits completely outside of law. But Abraham's process also sits completely outside of Christian conversion. So it's such a neutral example, because it doesn't really fit the mold of either Jewish type of life and approach to God, but it most certainly does not fit the idea of becoming born again by going to a service and then having yourself baptized and then being filled with the Spirit and then being careful before you can lose your salvation. It doesn't fit those molds. And so this was such a great example, because he's employing the idea of Abraham to try and show the Jewish people that, look, it all started with someone who had nothing to do with the law and couldn't work in any way for God's righteousness, which is the result of justification. But it came to Abraham, and Paul uses the idea that it came to Abraham by faith, right? Which just means trust, or by believing. Simply it means putting your trust in something, in this case, of course, in God. So he's saying, look, if Abraham was justified because of what he had done, he could go around and tell people, I was justified and accepted by God because of all the great things I've done. But he could never come to God and put that case before God, because God and Abraham both knew Abraham did nothing to be called by God. Yeah. So this is the first place where we need to think clearly about how Abraham becomes this man that it kind of receives the promises of God. What did he do to be justified and be found righteous? Really didn't do anything, really. God came to him. The reconciliation starts from God's side, right? So, but what did Abraham need to do to get the promises? To walk a path of salvation and transformation, he had to trust the reconciliation that had already happened. And I think that's a good way to think of it, but we'll talk a little bit more as we run through these scriptures here. So we're trying to answer, sorry, I've completely forgotten to say this, but we're trying to answer a question today, and the question is, how judgmental is God? I've got a good answer at the end. I think it'll be a good answer. Thank you, Tori. Okay, so he says then in verse 4, and it's unfortunately King James, says, now to him that works is the reward not reckoned of grace, right? It's not of grace, but it is of debt. And so he's trying to explain to us God and Abraham's relationship. And he's saying that if Abraham's reward, or if Abraham's reward comes because of what Abraham had done,
Yeah.
it's not grace. And it's actually a transaction of
Yes.
debt and debit and credit, right? For those of you who had some form of accounting, it's a debit and credit transaction in which Abraham does something and God responds with justification, right? But then he makes it clear. He says, look, God, Abraham didn't work for it. He didn't work for it, but he trusted him that justifies the ungodly. So yeah, we find this, and it's beautiful here because he's basically saying, okay, there's these two things. There's faith or belief, and there's works.
Yeah.
And this is where your question comes in. So what does it mean to believe and to have faith? And I want to answer it by like this. It looks nothing like any works.
Yeah.
Maybe I can't say exactly what it is.
Yeah.
I'll leave that open. But one thing I do 100% know, it is not a work.
Yeah.
So if we turn faith or belief into a work, we're done. Because we take away from what it was supposed to be. This justification is a free gift. Now in Romans 5, we might not get there today, but Romans 5, in about 4 or 5 verses, the idea of gift comes up again, and the idea of free gift comes up about 5 times. You can't put it plainer
Yeah.
than the idea of a free gift. But what throws us is we see by faith. And because we can't take it as free, the problem is that we want to turn faith back into a certain type of work that needs to be done for God to accept. The word maybe being justify, or another word that's used in the New Testament, or God being reconciled to us, which means peace between us and God, right? Or at least peace from our side to God. So that's the danger, Tori, is that we turn faith. Yes, we are saved by grace, or by faith through grace, or actually by grace through faith. But we have to understand grace as something that is free, because
Yeah.
if we don't, it's not. And so I think there, I kind of, a large portion of my last couple of years with a specific movement has redefined grace as something that it's not free anymore. Sorry, and you'll recognize when I say these
to
things.
receive the free gift.
That's the problem.
It's a what do you call it? A juxta.
Yeah, it's is it an oxymoron?
Oxymoron.
Oh, it's some type of moron, but
Yes. Come
it's
and
no
do this
longer
to
free.
get your free gift.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So ideas like giving into grace would be giving money to receive grace. Like, guys, we're bordering here on nullifying what a free gift is, or be close to a specific person as a grace carrier, or if you're faithful, grace flows from this, grace flows from this. And we ended up talking about grace again in such a way that we have to put something on the table for that grace to come. In other words, it's exactly the opposite of what Paul is saying in verse 4, that if we did anything for it, it is no longer grace. And I think I've come to the conclusion that if you want to understand grace, you have to understand what free is. And I've also come to the conclusion that we humans don't easily understand what
That's
free
hard.
is. It's only a theoretical concept to us. We actually don't know how to practice it. And last time we spoke a lot about Jacques Derrida's idea of a free gift, that it doesn't actually exist at all for us as humans. But it might actually exist for God. And I think Romans here, and you got to keep into account, take into account at least that Paul's dealing with Jews, 2,000-year-old Jews. He's dealing with 2,000-year-old Romans. So he's leading them out from wherever they were at that time. Okay, so yes, Abraham believed and was justified because of his faith, but not because of his works. So I think the problem here is once we say, okay, but that means we have to do the work of belief. No, we can't say that because it can't be by works. So whatever faith means, it can't include us making the first step or the first deposit. Justification comes from God. It's something He does. Yes, we respond to it. And when Abraham does respond by an unwavering trust, that leads Abraham further into what we find in verse 13, a promise, a special path, a path of deliverance, a path of at least in the context here, deliverance, protection, etc. Because we know there's a journey here, there's a story in Abraham's life bringing forth the heir, Isaac, that would eventually bring forth Israel. Okay, so that's the first thing I'd like to say, is that when we're speaking about how God approaches humanity, I think we've got to be very careful that as humans we don't turn faith back into a works, because we know, at least from Paul, that faith is not about works. So whatever faith is, I like to think of it as trust. But I also realize that the work of reconciliation does not come because of my trust.
No.
It does not come because I have a 100% unwavering faith in God. I don't think anybody really does. It would come to no one if that was the real measuring. And it was never the real measurement. And I don't think it was ever supposed to be, because God knows there's no one that can actually do that. It's His gift He gives to us. And I think that is a real freeing moment, Tori.
And that the faith is the trust that it is free.
Yeah. Well, we find an interesting thing in here in verse 5, because Paul goes as far as to say, He's the one that justifies the ungodly. Now that is interesting, because ungodly here doesn't just mean people who are in ignorance doing things wrong. Ungodly here means the irreverent, right? Those who condemn God. We talk about enemies here, really. We're not talking about people who, I'm not sure, We're talking about people who condemn God, which means that they are really an enemy. From an earthly point of view, from a human point of view, they are God's enemies. How does God justify His enemies? And if we think about that a little bit, we might say, okay, yes, but they were enemies, and then they did A, B, and C, and then God would justify them. But just a chapter further, Paul further clarifies. He says, while we were enemies. In other words, he's not saying that to be justified, you need to turn from being an enemy, then God can give you this free gift. Now, that's no longer a free gift. In fact, Paul goes as far in chapter 5 by saying, while we were enemies. And therefore, I'd like to make the case that justification does not come by putting your hand up in a Sunday service. It does not come by saying a specific prayer, but that it actually came to all. Because that's what Romans 5 says. It comes to all. It is the free gift of God. What we do with that gift is up to us. Whether we will take it in and now start acting and trusting upon it, it will lead us into promise if we do, if we take the life of Abraham as an example. If we don't, we might live in that ignorance all our lives. But it's not something we do by a formula. Now, the Jewish had this problem that the greatest part of their formula was circumcision, right? Circumcision is not part of the 10 Commandments, but circumcision was the way in which you made yourself part of this thing, right? And Paul uses circumcision right throughout chapter 3, 4, and 5 to say, look, it's not about the religious hoops you're jumping through. You can't earn this by following certain formulas. Now, I like to call them religious hoops because I think if we use circumcision, we think of a 2,000-year-old event and an idea, and we can easily be trapped in our own forms of circumcision. So if we can call them religious hoops, is the things we do to be accepted. And this is so deeply, I think, ingrained in human nature, that we want to be accepted by people, and we do things to be accepted by people. Like we all like to think that we don't. We all like to say, like, I don't care what people think about me. The reality is there's a deep longing inside of humanity to be accepted. And I think we might have misunderstood God. My fourth child is acting up this creepy in the backyard. We might have underestimated God, and we might have, like we said before, put him in a human box where we just cannot get past the idea that he could accept us freely, that he actually understands where we come from. And we spoke a little bit about that last time, like him placing us here. If you want to go back to Garden of Eden, he put the tree of knowledge and of good and evil there. He understands what we are, why we are the way we are. And so justification from his side is saying, I accept you. I don't want you to continue the way you are because you're causing a lot of havoc around you. But you, the person, I accept you and I reconcile with you. In other words, from my side, at least as far as it depends on me, we are at peace with one another. And so I think to approach God knowing this, or starting to understand this, or starting to come to grips with this idea, changes your life. Because you realize you don't have to do anything for that acceptance.
Yeah.
You also later on, from a maturity point of view, obviously you start realizing, hey, if I don't follow God's way, let's call it that,
Yeah.
I'm going to end up in trouble all the time.
Yeah.
And being accepted is not going to help me when trouble comes.
Yeah.
Following
Yeah.
is going to help me when trouble comes, and this is where the idea of salvation, of course, comes in. I think it plays well on the historical idea of Israel and how when they followed God's ways, there was salvation for them. When they didn't, they were almost always overtaken by Midianites, Amalekites, the Babylonians, etc. You know the stories. So let's just get back to here. So then he brings David in, and with David comes a word called or a word impute. And basically the word impute means to like credit your account, you know, like if you have clients and you credit their account with an amount, it means that you've taken the initiative so they can draw upon the credit. And so the idea of imputation is exactly that. It's to credit our account. And so it seems to me like the relationship between God and man starts off with this credit that God deposits. And I think Jesus is, of course, we, as Christians, we say that happened on the cross. That's where the credit took place. And I'm kind of happy to work with that. But I think it's much larger than that. It seems to be much more just a demonstration of the credit, what was already there, and it had to be done in time and space for us to understand it and to come to grips with it. Most certainly hard for primitive people to come to grips with this type of credit to our advantage. We can't accept ourselves because of our own faults, and so it's hard to accept that as we perceive God, a perfect, holy, pure God could do such a credit for us.
Yeah.
We don't accept that. Our psyche won't allow us really to come to terms with that. We feel like we need to do some type of work.
Yeah.
And Paul says, no, this is different now. And I think as Christians, modern day Christians, we do have to be careful that we don't step back into these same traps.
Yeah.
These particular two ones that we, number one, think that we have to do something for our peace with God or our reconciliation with God. And number two, that we think he's only our God. You see, I think they flow together. I think,
Yeah.
Tori, if you realize that when you meet someone in the street, that if you let's accept for a moment that that person has been reconciled to God and that God has already accepted that person, there really is nothing like an enemy really anymore in that sense. And once you realize that, you also start realizing, but God is not just my God.
Yeah.
He's not just done this for me because I go to church.
Yeah.
He's actually done this for people.
Everyone.
He's made that credit for everyone. Yes, we choose whether we follow I'll call it a path of transformation or a path of salvation, if you like. But the transaction does not depend on what church you go to or what formula you've followed. I mean, it goes as far as growing up as a young Pentecostal pastor's kid. We didn't really believe that Catholics are saved. No, it's true. You too.
I didn't even think of the cat.
You didn't think of them, yeah. We thought of them a lot. But the point is that other people who
Yeah.
are deeply religious, if I can use the word,
Traditional.
they love God, they love Jesus, they might do things a little bit different, but because they didn't go through our formula, Tori, they are not included in this special thing that God does for us because we have the right formula. That's a problem. That's exactly what was going on here between Jew and Gentile. And Paul is trying to say, look, guys, it's not about formula. It's not about circumcision or uncircumcision. This is something God does And it really is a free gift. Grace truly is free.
Yeah.
It's huge.
Yeah.
It's huge. Okay, so let's jump back in here. Let me see how much time. We don't have too much time, but so he says he justifies the ungodly. I mean, that says a lot. Then he brings in David, and I said that David speaks, and let me read this from verse 6 of chapter 4. Even as David also describes the blessedness of a man unto whom God imputes righteousness without works. Now, righteousness is kind of like the equity, I think is the simple English word for the Greek word, the equity that God imputes. It's the great amount of credit God gives in some sense, without any works. This great credit comes and it's imputed. And I think imputed gives us another it gives us another clue as to what's going on
Another
here.
angle,
Yeah, it's not a transaction that we do something for. It's an imputation. He goes further. He says, and blessed is the man whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. And then he goes on to say, blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. Sure, what's going on here? Like, what does that mean? Because it's obvious we all miss the mark. That's obvious. That must be obvious to God as well. I mean, that's not going to be a surprise to anyone. But it seems like God, and interestingly enough, the word cover here is used. Not doesn't see it, doesn't recognize it. The missing of the mark, which is done by all of us, is covered. In other words, it's what we said earlier on about what justification could mean.
Yeah.
It's God saying, I know what you're doing, and I know what it's causing you, but I want you to know that I accept you, even though you're busy with A, B, C, and D. And that there is no D, E, and F that you can do for me to accept you. My gift is free. I think in the large picture it actually makes a lot of sense. I think, anyway, but so he calls David, and he quotes David on, and even David had the idea that there would be some form of a relationship where even though sin is present, it would not be imputed. And even though sin is present, God would impute something else, an equity, a righteousness. Come, I accept you. Let's move forward. Let's build on this relationship, that type of thing, right? So he says then, he comes back to Abraham, of course, and he says, now, does this blessedness come only to those who are circumcised? Or also upon those who are uncircumcised? So does this gift, is it for those who jump the hoops or those who don't jump the hoops? That's what he's asking.
Yeah.
And we can ask that question today as well. This justification, this gift, this free gift, is it for those who go to church or is it for everyone? Is it for those who have followed a formula or is it for everyone? And if you say, no, okay, it has to be by faith. Now, define that faith. Because if you define it as a work, you disqualify it from being faith.
Yes.
And if you are saying that, no, would faith basically just mean you have to 100% believe and not doubt with anything at any point, in any moment, that's just not possible. And so it just seems that the idea of free gift seems to be exactly that.
So much more simple.
That it's a free gift that we have the choice to respond to. He goes on in verse 11, and then of course we get to verse 13, which now deals with the promise to Abraham. And now he's talking about Abraham, and obviously you know Abraham's promise. God makes him a promise in Genesis 12, and how now Abraham is required to trust God, to believe God, or to have faith in God for this particular promise. Absolutely. I mean, if he didn't, he would never have had Isaac.
You've got to walk into it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, not saying faith is not important. Faith is critical for any form of salvation journey, deliverance journey, promise journey. But the gift does not come because we're so good at believing, because that just becomes another work. We have to be careful of that. Now, I'm not going to jump into Romans 5 today because I'm kind of running out of time. But you can take a journey there, and I think otherwise we'll just deal with it next week.
Now you have to answer the question.
I'm going to answer the question before we finish off. But Romans 5 is about the free gift. It's the central, really the central passage, and all of this actually leads into this place of the free gift. And he uses the idea of Adam as first man and Jesus as kind of, I think the Bible calls him the last Adam, to explain how this works. And we're going to deal with that next week. It becomes so simple, Tori, and so clear. But I think our unwillingness or our inability to receive something for free has made us complicated. We just turn the word free back into no but first. So I'm not gonna deal with that, but I'm gonna do that next week. We're gonna do Romans 5. But I would like to end off, and maybe I would have answered the question a little bit better if I'd done Romans 5. I didn't plan to run out of time here, but I will answer the question. This is my answer. Is God, or how judgmental is God? And I would like to answer it like this: less than you, much less than us, much less than what you could ever think. You see, judgment, the idea of judgmental comes from, of course, we put God in certain boxes. We call him king, we call him judge, we call him warrior. We get these ideas, of course, from the Old Testament, and this is not uncommon for ancient people to push the God into the box of what they can understand. And of course, the idea of a king, a judge, and a warrior is basically a human idea. And so when you take that jacket and you put it on God, you immediately limit him to what he could actually be. And so to be God being judge, which is something we would all, we'd all accept that because it's a theme used right throughout Old and New Testament. But we have to ultimately realize that it is really a human jacket that we're putting on the infinite. And so most people's answer to the question would be, of course God is judgmental. He's very judgmental because he's a very good judge. But I think we have to be careful that we're not putting the human jacket on him and want him to be like us, because we are so judgmental. The problem with free gift is it takes away judgmentalism. Because it's no longer about how good you are for what you receive. It's not, I've been so good, that's why God accepts me, which was kind of the Pharisees and the scribes. It was their mentality. It was the thing, the pet peeve of Jesus was exactly that. Exactly that some thought they were better than others because of what they had done. And I think this is what Paul's trying to explain to the Jews. He's trying to tell them, look, this thing is free. In other words, I'd like to answer the question like this: how judgmental is God? Much less than you. Much less than me. And we're going to think about that. Because if we do understand, if we do for a moment consider that this gift of reconciliation, justification really is free, we have to conclude also that God is much less judgmental than what we are. So I leave you with that. Next week we'll jump into Romans 5, and that's going to be a real interesting one because it makes mention of the free gift so often. But I really want to take some time on the idea of Adam and Christ. And Paul takes big picture, when Paul starts calling Adam into the picture, and Christ is his time, and Adam is, in Paul's view at least, is the first guy that ever walked, first guy that ever breathed, the beginning of humanity, and the now reality of Jesus. He puts them into one package, and he frames it within the idea of the free gift. And I think that it's really, really interesting. How judgmental is God, Tori? Less than me. Much less than me. Guys, have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week. Cheers.
See you next time. Thanks, guys.